All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming tonight. Really good to see you all. Welcome back for those that have been with us for a few months after our month hiatus that we usually do in the summer. Again, Krista Hoffman-Longton. I am a faculty member at IUPUI, and I have the privilege of serving as a moderator for this amazing group, Books, Booze, and Brains. And so we've been meeting over Zoom for a few months, but I always try to remind everybody about some ground rules just to kind of help us stay focused and make sure that we're being supportive of one another. So make sure to mute yourself when you're not talking. Just about everybody should be muted at this point, but to mute yourself, you just click the microphone in what is usually the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Please be yourself and be respectful of one another. Sometimes we can feel a little anonymous in this space, and it's always a good reminder to just be respectful. The easiest way to ask questions while we're talking tonight is to use the chat feature, which is the little word bubble at the bottom of your screen. You can just click that and open the chat box. Leah and Mayas, my great colleague from Indiana Humanities, will help me to monitor the chat. I always try to keep track of the chat while I'm talking, but I always miss something really fun and exciting. So thanks again, Leah, for that support. You can use the reactions feature if you'd like on the toolbar. If you hear something that you like a thumbs up or applause, those are down there in the reactions tool if you want to use those. They're a little bit like emojis. And one of the things to remember is that we will get to a point likely toward the end tonight where we'll have some time for open Q&A. And at that time, we, depending on how many folks we have and whether or not we can manage it, we'll have you turn on your mic to ask some questions. When you do that, just remember that there's a short delay after you turn on that microphone. So you'll turn it on, take a breath, and then ask your question, and then we'll make sure that we get the whole thing. So with that in mind, just want to say a special shout out and thank you to the amazing sponsors of Books, Booze, and Brains. That is Indiana Humanities, Indiana Sciences, and March for Science. We have Rufus Cochran, who handles all of our live streams. So welcome to all the folks that are joining us on Facebook and YouTube. And then Central Indiana Science Outreach. We're always happy to have you and have your support of a program like this. So tonight, for those of you that have the opportunity to read the book, we are reading Bill Schutt's book, Cannibalism. And one of the things I loved about this book was that it was different than I expected. It was a mix of both, some of that historical element that I think that we liked that we got in our previous month before last when we did some of the history of Victorian medicine, but it also had a lot of current research and how research is changing around thinking about this topic. And so with all of that, we have a really amazing scientist with us tonight, Ellen Ketterson. Ellen's wave, so everybody knows if you're looking at us in Brady Bunch mode there, you can say hi to Ellen. And what we'll do in terms of our format for the evening is as we've always done, which is Ellen will answer some questions. And at some point during the evening, there'll be an opportunity to do what is the virtual equivalent of turn and talk questions. And to do that, we'll move all of our participants into breakout rooms. I've assigned your breakout rooms randomly, so you'll get a chance to meet some new folks. When you get into the breakout room, you'll want to unmute yourself. You can have a great conversation with the folks that are there. And then I'll give you a little 1-minute warning to bring you back to the main room where we'll ask more questions of Ellen and chat more about the book. So that's the format that we'll take. Let's see, before we get started, are there any questions about the technology? If there are, you can use the chat box to virtual equivalent of turn and talk. Or if you can't find it, something, let us know. And to do that, all right, seeing none. Ellen, thank you again for being here. We really appreciate having you. If you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your work and how it connects to this month's book.
Well, thank you. And hello, everyone. It's really nice to see that people are interested in this book and have decided to share your evening with us. So my name is Ellen Ketterson. I'm a professor of biology at Indiana University. And I was actually an undergraduate at Indiana University. So been here for a really long time. I did go for a postdoc in Washington State and taught a couple of years at Bowling Green State University in Northwestern Ohio. But since the age of 18, and that was really quite some decades ago, Bloomington's been my home. I'm a lover of birds. My brother was a a Boy Scout. He won a badge for studying birds, and he taught me how to identify birds before I could read. And then there was no birds in my life until, really graduate school. And then I became quite interested in birds again. But I'm an ecologist and an evolutionary biologist and an animal behaviorist. So, ecology, evolution, and behavior are my things. And that's the group that I belong to in the Department of Biology at Indiana University. I'm also a person who helped to found a Center for the Integrative Study of Animal Behavior at Indiana University. I did that with a man named Bill Timberlake, and that was back in 1990. And the center is still there, and we now have an undergraduate major in animal behavior. And that's one of the things that, I look back on a lot of years of being associated with the university, and I'm very happy that happened. I'm also a person who helped to found the Environmental Resilience Institute, and that's a new organization at Indiana University, quite remarkable. And it was a grand challenge recipient from IU to help prepare Indiana for environmental change. So there's a group of natural scientists and social scientists and humanities people who are focused on being prepared in the sense of having accurate predictions about what's likely to happen, solutions that are feasible. It's one thing to have solutions, they have to work. And then effective communication about those, because as we have a question coming on later in the hour, I think, climate denying has been a thing that the US and the world has had to face. And so we're very much engaged with trying to meet the misperceptions that people may have about climate change so that they can get their questions answered and see a path forward, because, as we said, prediction, solutions, and effective communication. I study a bird called the dark-eyed junco, and it's also called a snowbird, and that's the bird that I've been curious about and that has led my path through life since I was, 22 years old. It's a great bird, and it breeds in Canada and winters in the United States. So there are lots of opportunities to learn about it as kind of a representative of North temperate, North American sparrows, or, songbirds in general. I've studied migration, and I've studied the impact of hormones like testosterone on behavior and on fitness, how long the birds live, and how many offspring they produce. And now I'm back around to migration again. It's an amazing time to be studying animal migrations. There's all this new technology that lets us track individuals from where they spend the winter to where they breed and then back again. Little tiny tags called, geolocators that monitor the day length and can tell you where a bird is with respect to latitude and time, all the way up to not big enough for small enough for a songbird yet, but tags that are talking to the space station right now. I mean, honestly, can you imagine that? I could not have imagined that. So you might have a goose that you could put a tag on that would check in with the space station and check back to tell you where it was. It's interesting for its own sake, but it's also terribly important that we know more about how breeding ranges and wintering ranges are connected and where birds stop in between if we have a desire to conserve them and to retain the ecological services. Okay, none of that was about cannibalism. So I really enjoyed reading this book, and I expect you did too because you're here. Some of the people in it were familiar people to me. David Fennig, who studies the spadefoot toads, is just, a person that one biologist would know the way other biologists know each other. It's a fascinating system that you would convert from a vegetarian tadpole to one that ate your fellow tadpoles as a function of food shortage and a shrinking pond. So just being a spadefoot toad and trying to make your way in the desert with a pool that opens up when the rains come, but is inevitably going to dry out, and there's only a finite amount of time to convert yourself from being a pollywog to being a toad. And sometimes it helps if you can eat your brethren. And so we learned about that. I thought that was really pretty fascinating. I was fascinated by the bears. I think we have a question that we're going to come back to the bears. Dinosaurs, I mean, this invertebrate, that early human. Turns out that cannibalism is not as rare as people might have thought. And I think we have Bill Shute to thank for that, because he brought all these examples together. And he's funny, of course. I'm kind of a serious person, so I didn't laugh every other page the way I could have, because he was certainly working at it. But he did have me laughing out loud a couple of times. I wish I had put a little corner down on the page so I could share those with you all. Anyway, I think probably here's a guy who, I don't know this, but I expect he teaches a vertebrate zoology class, right? And that he's been gathering examples about everything. Well, and not just vertebrates. He may teach a comparative biology class as well. And probably had a set of lectures, and probably is a funny guy, and his students probably really thought he was great. And then at one point he thought, wow, I could make a book out of this, And I think he's told us that he studied bats first and made that something interesting with respect to bats sucking each other's blood. But then he realized that there was even more to be shared with us as the general public reading about science and wanting to know how it's done and how people reach conclusions. And I'm very grateful to him. I appreciate the opportunity to have read. So that was maybe a longer introduction than you had in mind.
No, that was great. I think that
Okay.
everyone really loves to hear. I mean, I think that that's one of the reasons why we come together, right? Is that you have sort of an opportunity to not only share about the trajectory of your career, but thinking about this topic in a new and different way. And I think that you did a really good job of sort of summarizing that for us. And you touched on something, Ellen, that I would love to maybe ask you to expound upon a little bit, and that's sort of how this book asks us as I understand this book to be primarily targeted at the sort of non-scientist, or at least non-zoologist public, right? Like, kind of, this is not necessarily a book for experts, obviously, given the number of dad jokes in this book, and Bill is strong with the dad joke. As I was preparing for tonight, I was writing my questions and talking to a friend, and a friend was like, you realize at some point in the night you are going to slip up a no pun intended kind of situation. So I'm just preparing all of you now for the moment when I have to when I say something is ripe for discussion, or we'll just leave those alone. So obviously, I think that I, as a humanist, as a social scientist, when I think about the word cannibalism, I often think about the concept of resorting to cannibalism, right? That's a phrase that I think we've heard before. But I think that Shut talks about this as it talks about cannibalism as really a sort of function of the natural world, right? He talks about the idea of animals dealing with overcrowding, a hunting strategy, even a way to take care of their offspring, right? Sort of seeing cannibalism as a caretaking, as in the Sicilians, which was one of my favorite parts. I had to look up Sicilians, and in the interest of full disclosure, I listened to this book in audio, and I was like, Sicilian, like Italy, and then I read the joke about Sicily, like Italy.
That was one of the good jokes.
That was one of the good jokes.
It was subtle. It was subtle, but it was there. Yeah,
it was there. Yes. So I'm wondering what, kind of from your perspective as a scientist, what does science tell us about cannibalism across the animal kingdom? And are humans sort of thinking about cannibalism in the wrong way? Which I think is sort of, to some extent, Schultz's hypothesis.
Right. Well, I don't really think it's the wrong way. Unless, of course, I don't know how all humans think about cannibalism. But I think that the way Bill Shute is asking us to think about cannibalism is a nuanced and subtle, despite the jokes, way of understanding that context matters. And perhaps the film that we might have seen of, a person popping off the head of another person is really not applicable to the natural variation that we see among animal taxa in the way that they raise their young, in the way that they respond to their conspecific. So he was pretty good about definitions, and I actually enjoyed that he was pulling up all the science terminology. He didn't have to, and he didn't belabor it, but he sort of told us that scientists have made specific and kind of non-emotional, pulling out of the Latin or whatever, ways of referring to behaviors or phenomena that make sure that other scientists know what they mean. So the kind of boring terminology was also, I think, an important part of his message. Then he would put it into terms that we could all understand and appreciate and laugh at, if that was the case. So I like that. And he defined cannibalism really clearly, as eating a conspecific, whether they're alive or dead. And then you go, well, what's a conspecific? And maybe that's familiar to everybody, but it's certainly worth thinking about that means members of groups of individuals that breed with each other and don't breed with other such groups. So whether it's a species of insect or a species of salamander or, a species of bird, which is what I think about most of the time, if you eat one of those, that group that you belong to, you've cannibalized, whether they're alive or whether they're dead. That's a pretty broad definition, I think, especially the dead. So we all need to eat. People will say that food and sex is what life is about. And so understanding all the different ways that we eat and we reproduce is part of the miracle of life. I love the notion of biodiversity and retaining biodiversity for its own magic. But then we also know that, we rely on services from all kinds of species all around the globe, and we can't make it on our own. So admiring biodiversity is an important part of staying alive, I think, as a species ourselves. Anyway, so he's good on his definitions. And he gives us a nuanced view of what cannibalism, how widespread it is, given his definition. And not much of it's horrifying, at least not to me. Now, I'm a biologist, so I don't turn away when people show me flesh, and I can take a blood sample from a bird's wing and not, be creeping about it at all. But it felt very natural. And I was particularly struck, the being crowded and eating each other is one thing. That's stress. That's maybe a little out of the ordinary. That may be induced by extraordinary circumstances. But sharing some of your own energy produced with your offspring, or sharing the energy embodied in some of your offspring to your other offspring, that's life. I mean, sort of as I see it. And so I think that trophic eggs that then you can feed to your young is a really cool example of, it's still conspecific tissue. It was made, but it consumed by you or consumed by your offspring, that it feels totally natural to me. So I want to be sure I'm not off your question. Am I responding as you'd
No,
sort of
yeah, I think that you're right on. And I think that for me, you touched on a really important point there that I wonder if maybe you can expand on. And that's the idea that I think in popular culture, we have a pretty narrow definition of cannibalism, right? That comes to some extent from constructions in popular culture, right? So you think of whether it's, Hannibal Lecter, whatever, the Donner Party. And I think that one of the things to me that's powerful about this book is the arc of the book, that he starts out sort of talking about all of these places where I think, at least for me, the first half of the book, I read this and I was like, I'm thinking about this all wrong. I'm thinking about this all wrong. And then we get to the second half of the book. And if you haven't finished the book, I think we're going to be the queens of spoilers tonight for you. I'm sorry about that. Because the second half of the book is very different than the first half. And I think that in some ways, that's the beauty of the argument in this book,
Yes.
right? He sort of sets us up to say, you think, these are all the ways that cannibalism is very common in the natural world, a lot more common than you think. Now let's go back to talking about humans. Which I thought, again, as a as someone trained in rhetoric, that's a very interesting argument to me,
Uh-huh.
because it does sort of push us to, again, ask those questions about definitions. And I think that, as you said, he takes incredible care in sort of unpacking that definition for those of us that are maybe unfamiliar with the science of it.
Mm-hmm.
So for you, was there anything surprising about the way that Shut defined cannibalism in either part of the book, or did you feel like it was concordant with your experiences from a scientific perspective? And why do you think that that's the case? Why do you think it is that the sort of broad community has maybe misrepresentations of what cannibalism actually is?
So that's a great question. I'm not sure I'm up to it. Let me say that I think the alive or dead aspect, um, I might have thought I would confine it to alive, and that dead tissue becomes dead tissue, and perhaps not identifiable as same or different. But I don't object to his having done it that way, and it allowed him to be much more inclusive, I think, in the kinds of behaviors that he included as cannibalism. I agree about that rhetorical arc. That's not a phrase that, as a biologist, I probably would have known to use, but I like it. And I think it's certainly true that he kind of let us in. And I didn't read the table of contents. I just thought, oh my God, I have to have this book ready. I want to read it. And then I was like totally drawn in. But I didn't see the human part coming at the end because, as I said, I didn't read the table of contents. So I'm just reading along and thinking, yeah, spiders and praying mantises and Sicilians. And then I was there with the extinct humans. And then I was there with the living humans under duress. And then I was there with humans with cultural differences and perceptions about the horror or not horror of cannibalism. And then back to sort of some modern day application. So yes, I think that was, the genius of the book is to draw you in, see how natural that kind of behavior can be, and then add the complexities of our manifestations of eating each other. Yeah.
Yeah, very well said. I agree with you. So I think that this leads us to our first turn and talk question. And as I said earlier, the format for these questions is that I'll share the question with you here, and then I will send you into a Zoom breakout room. If you've never been in a Zoom breakout room before, what will happen is a pop-up window will come up at the front of your Zoom screen that will say, please join breakout room number, insert number here. And you'll click that link and you'll be magically transported via amazing Zoom technology to a room where you'll see a number of colleagues that are here having the same conversation. We'll give you a few minutes, about 10 minutes or so, to talk among the group. I'll give you a little warning in terms of time, and then we'll come back to this main room where we'll have a broader conversation. And if you're joining us on Facebook Live or YouTube, Ellen and I will stay in this main room and have a conversation about these questions ourselves. So our first turn and talk question is, what are some of the ways in which we apply human standards to the animal world? And is that a problem? Why or why not? So certainly one of the squeamish parts of this book, obviously, is the idea that, we find cannibalism squeamish. Obviously, our animal colleagues do not. So what are some of the ways in which we apply human standards to the animal world? I'm watching cats and dogs go by in your screens for those of you that are here with your four-legged friends and coworkers. Is that a problem? Why or why not? So with that, I'll go ahead and open up breakout rooms, and Ellen and I will see you on the flip side. So Ellen, you will be invited to a breakout room. Do not join. So just stay here. Just stay here with me.
Okay, will do.
Okay. All right, looks like folks are headed to their breakout rooms. Let's see if we have folks that have any trouble finding their way. Just making sure that everybody's finding their way okay. I got much better at this once I started teaching in Zoom.
Yes, I haven't had to do that yet. And yeah.
It is an interesting one. Rita, do you want to hang out here with us in the main room, or do you want to join your breakout room? And Ian, same question for you. Either way, doesn't matter to me. You're muted, Rita, if you want to tell us.
Okay. I'll stay. I don't know how long I can stay, but I'll stay.
Okay, that's cool. We're happy to have you. Ian, if you want to join your breakout room, you can. You're in breakout room 2. Just let us know.
Yeah, same story as Rita, actually. So
okay, sounds good. So I'm going to move. Both of you guys happen to have been assigned to the same breakout room, so I think there are only 2 people in your breakout room. So I'll deal with that the next time around. All right, very good. So Ellen, our question kind of for this time while we get to hang out, just the 2 of us, and we'll sort of rehash this a little bit when folks come back, is so how do we apply, like, what are the ways in which we apply human standards to the animal world, and why might that potentially be problematic? What do you think?
What do I think? I mean, I know when you walk into somebody's house and the dog starts humping your leg, we usually just go, ha, 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 ha. But I think that you're having mentioned pets, it gives us the up and close and personal opportunity to see how other 4-legged furry animals respond to their environments. And I don't know, is it problematic? Everybody will talk about anthropomorphizing and assigning human qualities to animals that are, they're not human. I don't really worry about that a whole lot.
Oh, that's so interesting. So yeah, so say more why you don't worry about it.
Well, that attempt to get into another organism's view of the world, how they perceive it, what they hear, what they smell, how they respond, but interpreting it in light of a desire to be held, a desire to be loved, a desire to be needed, doesn't strike me as like such an awful thing. I think that if we can connect understanding different sensory abilities and different ways of lifespans and the like, that we're the better for it. I've never said these words out loud. I don't think anybody's ever asked me the question you're asking me before, but those are the words that come to mind. And we have 2 more people with us. I'd love to know what the other people think.
So Rita and Ian, if you want to go ahead and turn on your mics, you're welcome to while we're hanging out here. Rufus, and camera 2 is also Rufus, so he's busy with the live stream. But Rita, go ahead.
I'm still trying to figure out the question.
It's in the chat box if you want to take a look.
Yeah, I saw that. But,
So one of the things I was thinking about, Ellen, and part of this is just that, I am a consumer of information, right? Like I particularly am preparing for these because I feel very nervous talking about topics that are outside my area of expertise. So I try to get very prepared, like usual. But I was listening to a friend of mine when I told them about the book, and I told them about kind of what some of my perceptions of the book were. They asked me if I had listened to, I think it was last year's Invisibilia podcast about whales. Oh. And I have listened to Invisibilia in the past. If you've not listened to it, it's an NPR podcast that's very good. It's about all of the sort of invisible forces that shape us as humans. And the episode that they were referring to that I went and found, and again, in the interest of full disclosure, I listen to a lot of this while I'm exercising because I need exercise and I need mental stimulation.
Yeah.
It was about the relationship between whale and whale habitat conservation and the recording of whale songs in the late 70s and early 80s. So there was apparently one, and you, Ellen, may know because I only listened to it once, so I won't be able to give you the full history, but you probably know this, that there was a particular marine biologist who was able to make some advances around audio technology and record the sounds that whales made for the first time in the late 70s and early 80s. And he just because he was very interested in it, sort of released an album of whale songs that became kind of a cult hit, I guess.
I remember, yeah.
And
Yeah, I remember.
essentially it was this album that changed the way that people thought about whales. So there was prior to this, there was very little popular support for conserving whale habitat or conserving whales in general. And it was because of this kind of this notion that whales could talk to one another that all of a sudden the public was interested. And
so fascinating. This is Roger Payne, probably.
Yes, it was Roger Payne. Thank you so much. This is why I love to have these great. I need to write these things down so I really feel prepared. But anyway, I got to thinking about like the conversation about the polar bears, which of course we'll talk about, later. But if humans are spurred on to conserve or otherwise be cognizant of their behavior because they might apply human characteristics to animals or to even plants for that matter. Is that a bad thing then? I mean, because I think that some people, there's a critique about this, right? That you shouldn't be applying these because it's not realistic. But if the outcome of that behavior is better conservational practices, maybe that's not a problem.
So I think I'm following your argument, and I agree. So yes, usually the emphasis is on the shortcomings of anthropomorphizing because we won't understand the animals sort of as they are. But I think that this example that you gave is close to what was sort of coming out of my mouth, that the better we can understand, because we can only understand as we are, we can only understand as humans, then if we can identify with, and I think that's what the whale songs let us do, identify with that lonely sound in the water where you wouldn't want to interrupt. And then you simultaneously learn that whales keep their offspring with them for such a long time, and that there they are, these little tiny whales nursing on the bigger whales and then growing to be big whales themselves, that if we can see ourselves in other organisms and the way they live their lives, we care about them. And I think caring about them is really important. So I'm trying to agree with you.
It sounded really good. You made it sound way better than I did.
No, you made it great.
Rita, do you have thoughts about this? Can you think of a time when you sort of saw an animal as maybe potentially more human and thought differently about it?
I don't know, I just think about our cats and our dogs, how we put our emotions onto them and however they behave. Oh, you must be hungry or sad or happy or mad or things like that.
Rita, did you hear that you said dog and my dog wanted to talk to you about that? I don't know if you guys can hear this. My dog is in the other room barking. So again, anthropomorphizing, right, our animals. Right? Homer wants to say hello to all of you. No, but I think that you have a good point that is it, I mean, Ellen, do you think it is in our nature as humans to do this, right? We just have humans have a worldview. And so we want to apply that worldview to all things.
Yeah. I mean, that could be it. I don't want to interrupt if you were about to talk. Were you, Rita?
Go ahead, Rita.
Go ahead.
Okay. So this thing called cognitive ecology or, animal cognition, when I was coming up, there was a very anti-anthropomorphism kind of thing of this imposing on other organisms mental experiences like those that we have. And I think what we've learned, we can't get inside their heads. We can't be dogs. We can't be cats. We can't be, macaques, but they're so much more aware and strategic and processing of stimuli around them. They are not stimulus response things at all. They are assessors and making strategic responses to the things around them. So therefore, I think that the anti-anthropomorphism that was the overriding theme for so long has in a sense been undone by research that has taught us so much more about animal sensibilities.
That's really, I didn't think about the idea that like the whole concept of anthropomorphism is like a human intervention. So of course there would be like a support movement of it and a kind of denial movement of it, right?
Yeah. And I think it's
That's
moved
really
a great
interesting.
deal. So we would speculate and wonder, and then people would say, you can't, that's not how they are. They don't process information that way. They don't have that. They don't have that capacity. And the more we've learned, the greater the capacity, including all the responsibility that goes with that. That if, as you're learning from animals, are you confining them in ways that are unfair to them? Or are they predisposed to form relationships, and then instead they're forming relationship with you instead of perhaps with conspecifics, and so still rewarded in the way that being part of a group still happens. We're kind of all over the place on this, but I love it.
No, I think that you're exactly right. And I think that that becomes sort of this question, maybe that's the question really that we're wrestling with, right? Yeah. Is like, to what extent are we imposing this structure over something that we don't really fully understand?
Right. But the more the more we learn about tool using and problem solving in crows, much less primates, the more we have absolute proof that their mental lives are more complex than we ever had a way of knowing. So it's exciting. People are back?
People are back. Absolutely. That was sort of our 10-minute clock. So I always think that I'm interrupting what are probably really great conversations in the breakout room, but I hope that we'll be able to have some of that together as a larger group. So while you all were in breakout rooms, Ellen and Rita and I actually had a great conversation, because Rita may have to leave us quickly. And for those of you that have joined us a little bit late, we were just in breakout rooms. We'll move you into breakout room a little bit later. I think there were a couple of you that only had like 1 or 2 people in your breakout rooms. I might switch those up for the next time around, so that we can make sure to give you an opportunity to chat with others. But Ellen and I talked a lot about kind of this notion of human experience and the extent to which human experience is constructed by humans, right? We sort of make sense of our own experience. So we talked about all the ways that we obviously, give human qualities to our pets, right? That was the easiest place to go first. My dog wanted to talk to Rita while we were in the breakout time. It was amazing. He knew right on cue to know when to bark, because he's awesome. So I think as we think about these questions, and Ellen, I'll ask you just to sort of talk about that a little bit. I'll just mention very briefly that one of the things that I mentioned to Ellen as I prepared for tonight's conversation, I was chatting with a friend about this book, and he recommended an episode of Invisibilia to me that I will recommend to all of you. It was in last season, I believe, and it was an episode that was focused on the research on whale songs and how that changed public perceptions of whale conservation and whale habitat conservation. And it was the idea that for humans, by better understanding kind of how whales communicate and to what end, humans were motivated then to work in more concerted support, if you will, to find this. And I'll ask Rufus or Leah, if one of you want to, they will Google that amazingness that I should have done before this conversation started. If I was super prepared, look at how amazing my colleagues are in the chat box. Thank you. I love you all. So Ellen, one of the things that we talked about, and I'd love to hear you talk about before we get perspectives from the rest of the group, is just sort of about, you said that kind of when you grew up in science, that there was this sort of push versus pull around that's easy for me to say. You say it and you tell me what you said before.
Anthropomorphizing.
Anthropomorphizing. I'm going to get better at it. So you were saying that kind of when you grew up in science, there was sort of a trend, if you will, or conversation about that issue. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Happy to. What we were saying to one another is that as I was coming up with as a scientist, the elder scientists were saying you can't really be speculating about the mental experiences of animals because we cannot know. So when you do that, you're anthropomorphizing, particularly if you assign to them motivations or explanations for their behavior that are similar to, like what we would do. But I think in the time that I've been a scientist, there's been a huge growth in the area of cognitive ecology or animal cognition or just cognitive science. And so we have so many more ways to measure, and that makes it science, what it is that animals can do. So what kinds of problems can they solve? And what sort of anticipatory things do they do that clearly indicate that they have a memory of what they've done in the past and they're going to plan for the future? This whole planning for the future, we don't really have time, and I probably can't call it to mind, but if you ask a blue jay, actually a scrub jay, which food that is buried in the sand has a quick period of time where it will decompose and which one has a longer time, like a worm and an acorn, they will gauge their recovery of those food items knowing that they better get the worm first because the acorn can wait till later. And that kind of problem solving and appreciation for what's happening in the future. Back to anthropomorphizing, they can do a lot more than we ever thought that they could do. That gives us a responsibility. We can't just like write off their needs, whether they're cows, whatever. Minimizing suffering becomes terribly important, I think, in all that. And here's my cat. And my cat says, "What?" Anyway, that was what we were chatting about while you were in your chat rooms, but I'd like to hear about the chat rooms.
Yeah, me too. So I would love to hear from some of you about the conversations that you had in your breakout rooms, kind of going back to that initial turn and talk question, which was kind of what are some of the ways that we apply human standards to the animal world? And is that a problem? So what did you all say to one another? And this is a moment where if you would like to turn on your microphone to make some comments verbally, you're welcome to do so. Just don't forget that little half-second delay after you turn your mic on. And I should say as well, in terms of process, you do not need to raise your hand. Just go ahead and turn your mic on and that's fine.
We did talk about how say we have expectations that our animals have human traits and maybe they don't particularly love us. Maybe our cats will, will eat us when we die type thing. But, that type of conversation where, the traits that we have put on animals are not necessarily true, not necessarily true. That's basically, we had some other things to say, but would anybody else like to say anything? Or?
That's a good point, Kim. Absolutely. Yeah. Go ahead, Jennifer.
In our group, I had brought up that the fact that we have these pets that have been domesticated over hundreds, thousands of years. So we get to know those animals, and then I think some people then like extrapolate that to other animals. We mentioned how one fella in our group mentioned how, you get comfortable with your pets, you get comfortable with animals, and then you go to that state park and see a bear and you're like, oh, that bear likes me. But the bear's thinking, oh, lunch is walking toward me. How convenient. So it's bad for humans in that respect. And it's bad for animals too, because then people will want those more exotic pets. And so then we are affecting their lives. We're affecting their ecosystems by the way that we manipulate the environment and everything. So it's just kind of, everybody loses in a sense.
Good points.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Jennifer. It sounds like your group did a good job of kind of talking about both sides of that coin, right? That on one hand, one of the advantages as described, we talked about the whale songs, for example, is that it could incite folks to sort of conserve habitat or conserve resources. The bad side of that is that we end up in a situation where we maybe apply the wrong characteristics and either get in trouble with us or get in trouble with the natural world. So I agree with you there. Leah mentioned that her group talked about how humans might call an animal curious, and that's what we're perceived as a quest for knowledge, which is really an instinctive behavior rooted in protecting themselves and their offspring. And I think that that's a good point too, right? The idea that, we assign emotion to behaviors that are likely evolutionary in nature, right? That don't necessarily, don't have an emotion associated with them.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really good point.
This did not come up in our group, but it made the whale song example made me think of this, which is like, I know people who work in conservation, I think this has come up in past books, Brains and Booze, talk about like charismatic animals, animals that like dolphins are very cute. They look like they're smiling. So you can make certain kind of cases for conservation based on like the tragedy of losing these cute animals. And like, it's much harder than, there's like a consequence of our ability to only empathize with something that is cute or that practices behaviors that we, say, oh, look at this monogamous animal or something like that, as opposed to something that is just as much of a right to exist in the world that isn't very cute or doesn't practice behaviors that we can identify with.
It's a really good point, Leah. I remember this is very old. This will date me, and there will be people on this call that will be like, "Who are you talking about?" When I was a young person, I don't agree with all his politics. Let me just say that right now. But Andrew Dice Clay used to do a little bit where he would talk about the idea of otters sort of swimming around, and he would say something like would be the human conversation with an otter. What are you? I'm an otter. What do? I swim around on my back and do cute little human things with my hands. And you're like, okay, you're free to go. What are you? I'm a cow. Get on the truck, buddy. Right? Like I sort of, that was his bit. I probably didn't do any justice, but
That was great.
thanks. I'll keep in mind that I can add Andrew Dice Clay impersonation to my CV. But I think that I think that you're right, Leah, that one of the sort of hazards of this framework, right, that we come with a perspective about diversity, but particularly diversity of thought. But one of the hazards of that when we do that is that we forget that as Jennifer said really astutely, like you see that bear and think, oh, what a cute bear, and that bear looks at you and says lunch. And so I think that having those sort of multiplicity of perspectives really shapes our approach to thinking about something like cannibalism as is described in this book. So my next question is an Ellen question. Ellen, if and what's your cat's name?
My cat's name is Snowbird.
Okay, so of course it is. So you and Snowbird are ready for your next question. And it's a bird question, actually. So early in the book, Shud talks about the idea that cannibalism is relatively rare in birds. And he talks about their beak as was one of the primary issues about why cannibalism doesn't occur in birds. So my question, of course, is, do you agree or disagree? And can you talk a little bit about sort of the question of birds within the context of this book?
So that was my favorite question that you told me might be coming, because I'm a bird person. And so most of my examples that come to mind about anything, have to do with birds. So right away, I sort of asked, is that true? In my own experience, is that true? Is in the literature, is that true? And, I know about chickens and that they will have pecking orders and will beat up on the smallest one and then maybe pluck some tissue. So back to our definition, of consuming a conspecific, living or dead, then maybe the chickens will sometimes qualify, even though the quote motivation at the proximate level or the reason at the ultimate level might be not so much for the energy conserved as the status retained in the flock and the reproductive benefits of that. I know juncos that will be held in captivity. Well, occasionally there'll be a dominant bird that will chase the other to the point of exhaustion and then maybe peck at the brain. So those are maybe both examples of captive organisms. So then you want to know, well, what about out in the wild? So this was not very hard to find online. So I don't know, maybe Bill Shute had other things he wanted to talk about, because you can look up Google cannibalism in birds. We can all do that, right? And what I found is that there's a species of bird of prey, Eleanor's falcon. And I heard of Eleanor's falcon before because it lives at the Straits of Gibraltar and will bring down migratory birds as they're crossing over, trying to go from one land area to another. So I knew about them, but it turns out they will also take young from a neighboring bird's nest, same species, and tear it up and feed it to their young. So I don't think Bill's quite right about that not happening. Then I found red-tailed hawks, which are also a bird that we know, because you could find those in Indiana, have been reported to do the same thing. So yeah, that is, but I was more interested in subtle things. Do you mind my talking about birds a little bit more?
Yeah, no, of course. That's why we asked you. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I even wrote out some things here because I was so interested in the topic. So siblicide, which is killing your sisters, killing your brothers, is something that herons do. And they will kick their siblings out of the nest. Often there'll be 2 or 3, and the third one will have hatched last, and it is the smallest for a given amount of time. And herons are unusual in that they, pretty much have feathers to begin with, but they stay in the nest for a period of time. So they're not really clearly precocial or clearly altricial. And then this last hatched young, and the parents stand by while the sibs are attacking the young. And then the young can actually fall out of the nest and still be there and still be crying and not be noticed. So it seems pretty harsh. Do they eat them? Well, they don't actually seem to eat them. But then is that because they don't have the means? If you're talking about Eleanor's falcon, then she has, and he, a bill and talons. So the morphological structures that allow you to tear something else apart, a conspecific, and feed it to your young. But if you're a heron, you still have a pretty sharp bill that you can push down on your brother or sister, but not really the means to consume or tear apart. So killing your sisters doesn't really constitute cannibalism by Schutt's definition, but it suggests to me that it's within the behavioral repertoire of birds to benefit them individuals at the expense of members of their same species. In fact, members of their same family, so it's pretty close to home. And then I got into thinking about other kinds of brood reduction, because that's the phrase that ornithologists would use for taking, eliminating an individual that's in a nest, whether the parents do it or whether the offspring do it. But, another one is much more subtle. And you could actually say that, something like siblicide is premeditated by bird parents, except while I've just been arguing for cognitive perception, I don't really think premeditated. This would be a case where I think anthropomorphism would not work, but a behavior on the part of parents that has an influence on the likelihood of their offspring surviving, that is a function of the availability of resources in the environment. So female birds, think red-winged blackbird, they have a choice. They don't have a choice about how often they lay an egg. So you can only lay 1 egg a day. That's all birds can do. That's a universal. But when you start incubating your eggs, is in a sense a choice. And then choice would be another example of anthropomorphism, as opposed to a behavioral variant that would be favored by natural selection, so that individuals that behaved in that way would be more likely to offspring than individuals that behaved another way, without requiring that they go, I wonder if I start incubating today, whether that would be a good thing. So this is the kind of subtlety, I think, that's fun to think about, and also, quite interesting. I would think that this was below the cortex. This is like more programmed than not. In any case, many red-winged blackbirds, because that's our example, the females will start to incubate the night before the last egg is laid. So the consequence of that is that the first 3 eggs in a clutch of 4 will hatch before the last egg. And that means that the first 3 eggs that hatch into hatchlings are getting fed before the 4th egg hatches. So we've got a disadvantage built into the 4th offspring, the last one, as a function of the female's behavior. And suppose it's a good year and there's plenty of food, probably enough food, they all come through. But if it's not a good year, then this programming the last one to be more susceptible to starvation may lead to a situation where the first three are more likely to survive than they would have been had the female not begun to incubate prior to the last egg being laid. So that kind of hatching asynchrony is, to me, an example not of cannibalism, but of program behavior that has consequences for the likelihood of your offspring surviving. So do they actually eat them? No, they don't. If they die in the nest, parent will pick it up by the neck and carry it off and drop it in the marsh or, in the field. But I don't think it's fundamentally or conceptually that different from the mammals that may actually eat their babies. So I've walked into a colony of Siberian hamsters, not the Syrian hamsters that were the example in the book, but, hamsters. And they were kind of stressed by my walking into the animal colony. I had no idea this was going to happen. But I was looking into a Siberian hamster box. And, hamsters are so cute because they eat seeds and they'll fill up their cheeks. And then you think, oh, aren't they cute? Well, this hamster had some pinkies, which is a word that's used to describe to newborns, and went and put them in their cheeks. I was surprised. I can say I was surprised. Anyway, they did not take them out later. No, those babies were consumed. So, a hamster's set of behavioral options versus a red-winged blackbird's options, I don't think they're fundamentally different in our ability to understand that these are individual animals, females in these cases, making decisions based on proximate cues that have ultimate consequences for their likelihood of being successful parents and passing their behavioral variants onto their offspring. So, last one, okay. Because everything's so subtle, right? So back to the red-winged blackbirds. Female birds and red-winged blackbirds will deposit androgens in the yolk of their eggs. So androgens are like testosterone, a muscle building kind of a compound. So as it turns out, red-winged blackbird eggs number 4 versus number 1 have more androgens in them than the first laid egg. And those androgens are associated with a stronger hatching muscle. So that, again, depending on variable and somewhat unpredictable circumstances, being the last hatched, if it's a good year, can be compensated for by the androgens that the female has put in the yolk of the egg, which leads to a stronger hatching muscle and a better, easier way out of the eggshell, and a better way to, because if you're looking at newborn birds, all they can do is go. I mean, that's it. That's their full repertoire. Or they poop. They can do that too. They can do that very well. But that's about all they can do for the first few days. So I think I'm trying to capture one, avian examples, siblicide or hatching asynchrony or brood reduction, as being analogous while not being quite fitting Schutz's definition, and just bringing birds into our understanding that organisms do what they have to do. And what they have to do is a function of variation in the environment. And while it may not always look pretty to us, it makes sense in the sense that it persists over time, so it's working for them. All right, long answer.
No, it was a great answer. And I think that your examples really kind of brought us to this sort of deeper and nuanced understanding, which is part of what I think is interesting about this book and about these concepts, right? Is that we think about it either as you're eating something like you or you're not eating something like you. And I think that your examples really illustrate that we as humans are sort of bound by the language that we have to describe these things, right? So, you're talking about, you use scientific language, for example, to talk about the idea that there are 4 eggs, but that those first 3 are much more likely to survive because of when they were laid, right? Whereas, we could see that as sort of mom abandoning her baby. And that using, depending on the language that we use, depends on how we think about that example. And I think that Miles talked about that a little bit in the chat, right? That the idea that animal behavior, our perceptions of animal behavior are often shaped by the taboos that we experience in the world as humans. And I think that that's a really good point. There's a question in the chat, and I think what I'm going to do is I'll send everybody to Turn and Talk, because I think that we'll get to the answer to this question in the chat with our next Turn and Talk question. So for the person that asked this question that Leah was kind enough to transcribe for us, let's wait until we come back after the next Turn and Talk to answer this question. So my next Turn and Talk question is actually about a couple of the examples that are common to us associated with cannibalism, in particular the black widow spider and the praying mantis, right? Which is one of the places where Schutt starts out. And he sort of talks about the idea that when we think about cannibalism in the animal world, that's one of the places that we usually start. And I as I was writing my questions, I was thinking about the extent to which the black widow spider and the praying mantis sort of got a bad rap, given that so many other animals have this behavior, right? Like we've sort of villainized the black widow spider and the praying mantis for their behavior, but not this host of other animals that have this behavior. And so my question is, why do you think that humans have latched on to these particular stories, the story about the black widow and the story about the praying mantis? I have some theories about that. I imagine Ellen might as well, but I think that that'll get us to some of the questions that have come up as well. So again, the Turn and Talk question is, why do you think that humans have latched on to the example of the praying mantis and the black widow as these sort of quintessential examples of cannibalism in the natural world? So with that, I'll open your breakout rooms, and let me look at this a second. So there, so Georgiana and Miles, I think you were in a room by yourself. Can you let me know? We'll send everybody and let me know, do you want to stay in your room with just the two of you, or would you prefer to join a new room? And I can move you either way. You can turn your mic and tell me.
Why don't you send us some new people?
Okay, perfect, will do.
Sounds good.
All right, I think I've handled the breakouts. Let's see how we did there.
Was it hard to do to get everybody in a place?
It's actually not too hard. No, it's just kind of a matter of moving folks around. The biggest thing that I want to do in this space is make sure we have a relatively similar number of people in each of the rooms, in part so that the conversation can be a little bit more substantive. And so Andrew, welcome. I know that you joined a little bit later. If you'd like, I assigned you to breakout room 1, or you are welcome to just hang out with us in the main room here.
I'll see if I can find the breakout room here.
Let me see if I can, I think if I move you and move you back, that it will work out for you. Let me see here. See if that worked for you. And if not, you're welcome to just stay in the main room with us. And of course, someone is cutting my lawn right in the middle of this, right? It's like welcome to COVID time.
I can't hear it, so it's
oh,
okay.
Good. That's good. It's very good here. It's very loud in my room. So Ellen, so what do you think about this? So this is, why do you think it is that everybody was like, black widow spiders and praying mantises, they are the cannibals, not the other like 26 other animals that Schutt came up with?
Well, I think the idea of a female eating her mate is really like, talk about.
Ooh, so you think it's a gender thing?
I do, absolutely. For the black widow, absolutely. Yeah, the notion that this little spider, that's the male, is sitting on the big female, and then she lets him copulate with her, and then she eats him, even though there's variation in that.
Sure.
How can we not be excited by that? And praying mantises, they're just big enough for us to see it and to appreciate it, and they're beautiful, right? So, how can we not be fascinated by a beautiful green organism pulling something in and munching on it? It's just, so I'm not surprised that those would be the organisms that fascinated us the most in this regard. And then to find out that it's not unusual, but that there's the twist of the sexual reversal and the beauty, and because they are beautiful, right? praying mantises. Did you ever, as a young person, hang out with them for a while?
I did. Yeah, I did actually. And so I agree with you that I think that part of it is that they were beautiful to watch, and you could sort of watch it happen, right? Like that was one of the other, I think that it was an accessible image for us to see, versus the Sicilians, for example, which I think were my favorite example in the book, right, with the whole like eating of the lining of the female's sort of uterus after, you know, like that they were born with this tooth and the tooth fell out, and somebody was like, well, why would you be born with a tooth? Well, duh. And so but that's obviously a hard behavior to catalog, right? Because you have to kind of figure out, or harder, I should say.
Right. Well, and even to see, you know, you have to have somebody tell you about this, doing this in a very systematic kind of a way. But, you know, if we had known about Sicilians more generally, don't you think, you know, I haven't actually nursed a child, but you've got this baby munching on you, and you love it. And I think we have to think that the Sicilians love it, because there are these mechanisms that, you know, endorphins or whatever the comparable thing would be for invertebrates, that are rewarding. So if it's favoring our reproductive success, we will find it rewarding. And I think that's, you know, it's not a miracle because I'm not a miracle person. It's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think to your point, it is, it feels a little bit to me like about compelling narratives, right? Like that we like the story that's associated with the mother nurturing the child, right? We like that there's something exciting and interesting about particularly the relationship between sex and and consumption. And so, right, otherwise there wouldn't be, you know, all of the like, shows like Hannibal, right?
Right.
And so I think that it again, to me, goes back to the idea of human sense making, of us sort of wanting to impose a story that we created onto the world around us, right? We want to make sense of that experience. So even when you think about sort of the ancient Greek, you know, he was talking about the ancient Greeks in this case, right? That we made a decision at one point in time that this behavior was aberrant, and that it was humans who made that decision, and then people in positions of power just pass that concept down and down and down.
But not universally.
But not universally, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So I mean, it didn't have to be that way.
Right.
Yeah. So Andrew, what do you think?
Oh, I just remember a long time ago reading the book about the soccer team that crashed in the Chile in the Andes.
Yeah.
And then eventually they started, well, it was cold, everything froze,
right,
including the people that died. So eventually they started eating their dead teammates.
Well, I think that, Andrew, I think that you make a good point, right? That later in the book sort of talks about that experience and other experiences that are about scarcity, right? The idea that humans and animals to some extent practice this behavior in part because there's not enough to eat. And so I was wondering, so Ellen and Andrew, I think this relates to your comment. One of the previous participants asked about your perception about the significance of birds being captive and thus turning to cannibalism. Is there something about scarcity in that space?
So are we going to talk about that later, or are we just talking about?
We can talk about it now, and then we'll just repeat it later.
I mean, it's not a natural thing to have birds in cages, so their behavior could change probably in a lot of ways.
Good point.
So actually, I think that's how I would have responded to Andrew, or not necessarily causing them to be abnormal. They may well have been caused to be abnormal by being in, they weren't actually in cages, they were in a large room. If they'd been in cages, everybody would have been fine. But in a large room, there would be a dominant who could impose its behavior on a subordinate. But I think the other thing is we could see it. So, you know, if they hadn't been in captivity, I wouldn't have known about it. So whether that ever happens in nature, you know, I don't know. They're hiding behind leaves. They're hiding behind trees. That may be a behavior that's not abnormal, but I had an opportunity to see it. But I wasn't surprised to see the question because I actually almost didn't use the example. I thought, oh no, you know, that's going to elicit a sense that we shouldn't be studying captives. And I think there are, you know, always arguments on both sides about those things. But yeah, I was interested to see the question. So it may happen in nature. We don't know. We had an opportunity to see it, or we may have induced by keeping birds captive a behavior that's not in their usual repertoire. Both things. I agree, Andrew.
I thought that that was one of the really funny points of the book, Ellen, that I hadn't necessarily thought about when he did start talking about kind of humans and the behavior of humans later, right? That they were talking about some of the science behind this process and talking with anthropologists who, you know, they were saying, well, like, we haven't seen this behavior, so we can't know that it's true. And, you know, then there was one researcher that was like, well, we haven't seen people having sex, but we know that they do it because there are children.
Oh, wasn't that fascinating? On the other hand, it became sort of an excuse for not having seen too, right? Oh my goodness.
It did.
So many interesting points in this book. Yeah. And that was certainly one of them. Yeah.
And I thought that for me, like I said, I went into this book. I feel like this happens every month. This is why I love this book club. Every month I go into these books about science thinking, I don't know enough about this. I'm never going to be able to have a good conversation about this because it's just so far beyond my expertise, and how much of the experience of these books I realize are about the ways in which we talk about science,
yes.
How we sort of construct a narrative around science, and how that shapes perceptions of it.
And why it's so terribly important, the way we use the words we use, right?
Right.
And now we're into the humanities, right? So you can use multiple words to describe a situation that makes it comprehensible, or you can put a label on it. So I'm not really happy at this stage about the horror associated with the word cannibalism, if we're in fact finding that it's uncommon and inducible, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Let me bring everybody back, and then we'll talk about that, I think, a little bit more as a whole group. Thanks for sticking with us, Andrew.
Oh, thank you.
Ooh, look, you guys anticipated that I was closing the rooms. Good on you. You like had your 2-minute timer there ready to go. Welcome back, everybody. We'll just wait a few minutes for others to return. So while we're getting folks back, I'll just share that Ellen and Andrew and I had a really fun conversation about sort of the constructions of these stories and where they come from, and asking. We did get to answer that question in the chat. So maybe, Ellen, if that's okay, we'll sort of start with that question that was in the chat. I'll just remind you what it was here, which was kind of about the question about birds being captive and thus becoming cannibals. Sort of. That question about captivity. So we'll start there, and then we'll kind of delve into
back to the spiders and the
spiders and the praying mantises.
Okay. So I saw the question. I was very interested about birds being captive and thus being cannibals. So we did chat about it a little bit while people were in the breakout rooms. And I think it comes down to, were we able to see something that we wouldn't otherwise see because they were captive, or did that behavior become induced because they were captive? And I can't know the answer for that for sure, because seeing a behavior like that in the wild would be extremely challenging. Again, I work with these juncos, and I work with them in Virginia in the forest and the Appalachians, and much of what they do is behind leaves, behind trunks. So I have to cope with what I can. But the other might be that it was induced by captivity. And then if it was, I would think it would be the inability of the individual who was subordinate to disperse. So in the wild, an individual would be able to escape. In captivity, it wouldn't. I don't want you to picture, please, because everybody can be interested or potentially concerned about animal research, and I do it mindfully and with awareness and with a sense that what we learn is to the greater advantage even of the animals themselves. Anyways, when we saw that, we interfered. So I would not like you to think that was going on and on and on.
Well, and I think that that is the sort of larger kind of point or larger question that we had, which was about sort of why have we latched on, why have humans latched on to these experience or these examples like the black widow spider and the praying mantis, as opposed to all of these other examples in the world where cannibalism happens. And I think Ellen and I talked about a little bit about one of my favorite examples from the book was the Sicilians, right? The idea that we didn't really understand why they were born with this little tooth and then later found out that they, needed a food source. They were eating, mom's insides while they were hanging out in there. Before on their way out, then they lose the tooth and everybody's good, right? Leah, I saw your face. Leah was like, oh. I will say that I am not a squeamish person, but there were moments in this book where I was on my run listening and I was like, oh, I don't know about that. And I am, yeah, I mean, I will observe teaching in the anatomy lab all day long, but sometimes every now and then these things popped up and I thought, I don't know about that. But Ellen, you were talking about kind of what your thoughts were about the praying mantis and the black widow and why you thought those were narratives that were so strong culturally.
Right. Why did they stand out when so many other examples that we learned about were there? So, to me, it didn't seem really very hard. I think the Black Widow thing is the case of a female eating a male after an opportunity to copulate. So the sexual reversal of who's the dominant and who's the subordinate, and then the, excitation that comes with thinking that the male got eaten, and then finding that it doesn't happen every time anyway. But that, I think, is the essence of that one. And then to me, the praying mantis, and I've certainly observed them and been fascinated by their predatory behavior and willingness to eat what they can reach with their forelimbs. They're beautiful. They're just totally beautiful, and they're coordinated, and they're big enough to see. So both these examples make complete sense to me that they would have entered our awareness when so many other examples of organisms eating each other hadn't registered with us. The beauty of the praying mantis and the notion of a black widow female spider eating her mate after accepting his sperm. How can we not be fascinated by that?
I agree with you. One of the things that was interesting to me as we were talking is, again, about the extent to which we, as humans, sort of impose these gender roles, for example, on the animals, right? That we've sort of decided that that's one of the reasons why these narratives are interesting.
Yeah.
So I have one more turn and talk question, and I'm looking at the time. We have about 10 minutes left, so I can make it a quick turn and talk, or I can ask another question of Ellen and then leave a little bit more time for questions for her. So if you would like another turn and talk question, give me a thumbs up using your reactions button or your actual thumb. The other option is to hang out in the main room here with us. Let's see. Other turn and talk. Look, okay, this is very funny that Melanie and her partner are disagreeing, I'm noticing. That makes it very hard. I don't know whether it counted as one vote or two votes. It looks like there is a greater interest in staying in the main room here. So Ellen, if you don't mind, I'll ask you one more question that I know is a question you were excited to answer, and then we'll open it up for sort of general conversation. So the last question that I had for you today was about that, the story about the polar bear and the kind of problematic construction that happened in the media. So this is on page 66, at least on my version of the book, for those of you that have the book and want to kind of look it up.
Right.
And Schutt sort of talks about this problematic framing, and he wrote, as a result of the media framing of this issue of the polar bear and the polar bear cannibalism, a valid scientific hypothesis, global climate change, has led to a reduction in Arctic sea ice, and this may be causing increased incidences of cannibalism in polar bears, now takes a back seat to a distorted take on the subject, as well as a deceptive but well-executed argument by climate change deniers, right? So this was this moment in the book where the polar bears were seen exhibiting cannibalistic behavior, and folks came out and said this is because of a decrease in Arctic sea ice. But then it turned out that scientists said actually polar bears do participate in this behavior relatively regularly. And then some climate change deniers were like, see, we told you, you're lying to us. And so, but that's a gross, grossly simplified approach to the story. But Ellen, I was wondering if you could talk about the ways in which you have in your career kind of seen science misconstrued, and how you think that that shapes sort of humans' perceptions of animal behavior.
Wow. I'm going to stick with the polar bears for a second, but then I'd like, if I can, I'm up to responding to the sort of more general
Yeah, I think that'd be perfect.
question you raised. So with respect to the polar bears, polar bears, other bears, males will eat offspring if they see them. And so mother bears are very protective. We experience that as mother bears ready to chase us down if we interfere. But that protective behavior on the part of female bears is probably more shaped by males who are marauding, if you want to use a word like that, or just, see a small bear, have an opportunity by eating that bear, the proximate thing being the small, delicious looking meal, the ultimate thing being if your female doesn't have an offspring to care for, she will come into heat again and can be impregnated. So, then that's bears, that's lions. We learned about that. That's not that uncommon. So fascinating, right? I think the question has this other aspect of misuse of science by first setting up a hypothesis that makes sense to me, in that if there is less sea ice, oh my God, is there less sea ice? Yes, there's less sea ice. That's not an iffy, right? It was 100 degrees in, Alaska this summer. So yes, the ice is melting, and yes, there's fewer opportunities for polar bears to eat seals, and there's more encounters with offspring because you're not out on the sea ice and in a prolonged way, but you're actually closer to shore. It all makes sense in a way that there's a predilection to do it. There is less sea ice, there are more encounters, and so you see more killings, cannibalism, if you want to call it that, than you would have seen in the past. And then turning that as a, oh my gosh, misusing science to deny climate change. Oh my gosh, you all, I can't believe that you're here on a science evening and are not aware of merchants of doubt, are not aware that moneyed interests who will benefit from misinformation will deploy that misinformation to prolong uncertainty. That's the strategy, and we're the objects. And there's just, there really isn't any question about that. So when I was a kid, I was a smoker, and I was 18 and heard the Surgeon General saying that smoking is dangerous for your health. And I did it while I was sitting in my dorm room learning how to light a cigarette, because I thought I would be, I don't know, more socially acceptable if I was a smoker. So, the desire for acceptance outweighed the health thing, because of course I was only 18 and I would never die. But, it came closer then, that after I quit smoking, and then these stories would come out that, cigarettes were not really as dangerous as people were saying. And I think, oh, wow, that's great. I can smoke again. That's all personal. It's not that interesting. I just know that as an experience of misinformation by the merchants of doubt, my life was affected. Fortunately, I quit smoking. Climate change, whoa, this is not just individuals making individual choices about whether they choose to smoke or not. This is like our world being influenced by misinformation that leads people to be doubtful about the kinds of modifications that we could make. So it's life or death. I don't mean like for you and me today and tomorrow, but the misinformation using science. So taking the facts and manipulating them and using the language of science to mislead us is it's criminal. It's criminal.
Thanks, Ellen. I appreciate your perspectives on that. And I do think that your individual experience is one that helps us to sort of think more broadly about our own actions and our own sometimes inaction associated with these issues. So we have a few minutes left, and I want to just open it up for general questions to Dr. Ketterson if you have those. You are welcome to just turn on your microphone. No need to raise your hand. I think we're a small enough group that should be fine.
Nice to meet you all, by the way. I'd love to hear your questions.
I actually have a question about
that's okay. So
cat,
why don't we have Kim go first, and Georgiana, you can go second.
about the tadpoles and how some of the tadpoles, they wouldn't eat say things that were their immediate relatives, say their cousins. The cannibalistic tadpoles would eat other parts of their mating group, but they wouldn't eat somebody that per se was their cousin. It's odd to me that it's somebody they wouldn't actually mate with. But I was wondering if per se, how did the group fare that wasn't being cannibalized? Did they have a better access to, say, algae and things that were in the cannibal territory? Did that increase the fact that the entire family would survive simply because they didn't have to fear being eaten? I understand, that's part of it, but I was just wondering, how were there studies done on the individuals that didn't turn into cannibals within the same family units? Because they could be told, they could actually tell the difference and avoid eating their own relatives.
Good question, Kim. So just really quickly, Ellen, kind of summarizing there, that asking that question about sort of the tadpoles that chose not to eat their relatives, to what end, and how might that sort of change the way we think about cannibalism?
Right. So kin recognition, avoidance of eating your own kin, therefore requires some kind of recognition of who's your kin and who isn't. But it only goes so far, because you've got other tadpoles there that are becoming cannibals, and they're indifferent, and so they're going to eat the ones that are being preserved from being eaten by their own relatives, but they're nevertheless getting eaten. So I think it's an interesting question, but I think that, and it implies a way of knowing who your relatives are and who you aren't, and directing your behavior towards non-relatives, but I don't think it preserves your safety altogether.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ellen. Okay, Georgiana, you've got a question. Go ahead.
Well, this is, interestingly enough, this is kind of like a follow-up to Kim's, although it's very broad in terms of species. It's interesting to me that in some cases, polar bears, it sounds like, would eat their own cubs. And yet we also see species in which the mother and father co-nurture the offspring. And that seems like a pretty widely divergent approach to parenting. I mean, how does that play out in the entire animal field of the world? I mean, are most parents co-parents, or are most parents willing to eat their offspring?
I love this question. So for folks that are at home, maybe didn't hear, that question is essentially, there are, I'll summarize, a very wide set of approaches to parenting in the natural world, all the way from lots of like helicopter parents to sort of eating your babies. So how does this happen, Ellen? What's happening here?
You can't think I know the answer to that entirely, but I can say, with respect to the bears, the males are probably copulating with any female they get an opportunity to copulate with, and probably aren't aware, quote, have a mechanism for knowing whether a particular cub is their cub or not. Usually, I think they might, quote, depend on a spatial distribution, so that the likelihood that a cub they ate would be lower if it were a relative than if not. Biparental care is uncommon in mammals. Mammals pretty much don't do it. We do it, but mammals as a whole don't do it. Birds very much do. But, birds, even songbirds, males are copulating with females that they're not mated to, and vice versa. Females are copulating with those males. The male that's the mate of a social of a bird that at the nest at which he attends may not be the father at all, but he's still a faithful provider of offspring. So there's a huge variation, and it's all fascinating. And, the whole discipline of behavioral ecology is focused on, parental care and reproductive strategies. And it's a great question that you asked.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I agree. Really fun question. So we are out of time for this evening. If you would please join me in thanking Dr. Ellen Ketterson for being our amazing guest expert this evening. Give her virtual applause. Thank you so much for being with us, Ellen. This was a ton of fun. So just a reminder for those of you who maybe this is your first time joining us, Books, Booze, and Brains meets monthly, and we meet on the last Tuesday of the month. Next month's book is also an animal book. It is called Animal Madness: How Anxious Dogs, Compulsive Parrots, Gorillas on Drugs, and Elephants in Recovery Help Us to Understand Ourselves. And our guest scientist will be Brett Kruger from Indy Humane. So we'll be talking a lot more about animal behavior next month. We would love to have you join us. This is the same Zoom room. If you would like to be added to our mailing list, Leah has put her contact information in the Zoom chat box. Please join our mailing list, and we do not spam you. We just let you know kind of once before each event when it's happening and how to log in. Please, again, join me in thanking our amazing sponsors, which are Indiana Humanities, March for Science Indiana, Indiana Sciences, and Central Indiana Science Outreach. And thanks again to the amazing Leah Myers and Rufus Cochran for running our live stream tonight. Thanks again, Ellen. This was such a joy. It was really fun to chat with you.
I feel honored to have been with you and loved meeting everybody. So thank you. It was great.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. We'll see you in a month.
Okay.
Be safe out there.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
All of our upland friends, thank you.